the spine, combining all of those things, because if you we talked about it a little bit, when we talked about the core, we didn't really go over the back as much and training the back, because then when we go to the shoulder, it integrates more with the back and how the back works. So you kind of like core, anterior shoulder. It's also making a rainbow over the body here. So just a quick little overview, because when we look at the back, obviously we have the posterior shoulder and all the muscles that kind of attach there. So we had our rhomboids, we had our traps, we had our infraspinatus, supraspinatus, teres minor, teres major. They're all holding that shoulder onto the spine. The traps kind of connect that shoulder blade to your thoracic spine. So basically, we moved his hair out of the way from, thanks, right? So basically we have your T1 all the way down to T12. It's right about here. So those are your basically different vertebrae that line up. And then from here we have L1 all the way down to L5. And then technically we have your sacrum, which is S1 and S2. They like to stack up like cookies. We talked about this week 1 with the core and the spine, where they like to not move as much. So when we actually look at then the spine, we have our traps, which kind of stabilize our thoracic spine. So they attach from T1 all the way, and they really actually attach all the way up into like C3 and C2, which is your cervical spine, which is your neck. But then they come all the way down, right down to about C12, and so they have this diamond shape. We talked a little bit about that last week. And then your lats come all the way from the inside of your humerus, so that's where they end up, but they start down here at L5 all the way to L1. So, but really they come up to C12, they kind of overlap a little bit with the trap. But when we kind of look at the huge overview from the very surface level, we're going to just kind of skin Josh here and have just a raw picture of that. Why don't you like tuck your head down? Huh? Oh, you're good. You're good. You can relax. Okay? If we were to just totally skin him, that's what we would see at a very surface level, is we'd see a lat, and then we'd see his trap coming up to the side. Now, if we were to then cut it off, and here's what I want you to do. I want you to pull your shirt forward so it sticks against your back. Great. So now, if we were to kind of push in here, anybody start to see like this bread loaf shape that kind of comes up. So when we look at the spine, and when we look at training the back, we have to consider that your spine doesn't really like to extend quite as much, and it doesn't like to flex quite as much. So you have these two sets of muscles that run basically from the base of your neck all the way up at T1, all the way down to L5. So you have your, they call them your longissimus. It's like the erector longissimus or spinal longissimus. They've got long names. Everybody just refers to these as the erectors. Okay? The goal of these is to resist movement. So we don't really want them to be doing a whole lot. All right? So when we look at how they act, everybody know the difference between like isometric, eccentric, and concentric muscle contractions? Anybody know those? Yes, no? If it's no, that's okay. Let's go over it real quick, because I'd rather you know that. Right, so eccentric muscle contractions, the muscle lengthens out and resists movement. It's like the braking force. Isometric contractions, it holds forces. So think about like steel cables on a suspension bridge. Anybody been out to like San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge? You see all the big cords that are basically holding that bridge in place. And then we have concentric contractions, which is basically the muscle shortening. So if Josh were like pull his bicep, right, he'll do bicep curls. That shortening motion is that concentric contraction. So when we look at your spinal erectors that are basically run from the top of your butt all the way to the bottom of your neck, they function isometrically. So their job is just to resist movement, and really what's happening is that it's trying to stabilize the pelvis. Now coming off the top of the pelvis, it kind of makes like this weird like heart shape. So we're basically right off the top of Josh's butt, all the way to his bottom rib, is a muscle called your Quadratus Lumborum, or QL. So most of the time we just call it the QL because it's just way too long to say Quadratus Lumborum. Like, let's be real, okay? So your QL kind of stabilizes a little bit. Think about it like your obliques, but for your back, okay? Same thing, functions isometrically to then try to not create tons of movement, all right? Then we get into like really deep. You have your multifidi, which basically are between your lumbar joints They kind of run from like L5 to L4 and then L5 to L3, right? And they kind of work and basically lock in your lumbar spine. The reason this is all important, the reason we go over this whole this whole process, I almost said interview, that would be weird, right? Guys, everything, I had like way too much coffee yesterday and then I finished off another like 40 ounces on the way up here. We're doing great, all right? But the reason why we go through this whole overview is because they all tie in together. So when we look at training the shoulder, we'll actually start with more lat and track here, and then we're gonna work into then these deeper tissues and working into the erectors, your QL, and the multifidi. Because when we look at that, that's how we actually train the back, okay? So we're gonna look at that. Before we even get into that, we'll kind of warm up your back and just try to get you to understand a sequencing thing, because this is also gonna help when we talk about low back pain. Anybody have low back pain? Yeah, oh wow, okay. Well, no, you might actually be a good example of this. I'm gonna have you lay down on your stomach. Okay, so lay down on your stomach, doesn't matter which way. You okay if I put a finger on the side of your butt?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, great. For a second it sounded like you said no, so. Here's, when we look at then muscle firing patterns, right? We talked about spinal erectors are there to function isometrically, so they're not there to basically create a lot of motion. All right, now he can create a lot of motion, like if I ask Josh to pick your chest up off the floor without moving your legs, right? These are gonna fire, he's gonna get some isometric contractions, all right? Now, when we look at the firing pattern, because basically the back, your glutes, and your hamstrings form this thing called the posterior chain. They basically act in a certain pattern. Now, and we're gonna kind of pick on Josh here because Josh doesn't have super big glutes, okay? Don't worry, it's okay, right? We'll get to a lot of glute stuff, especially when we get to like hips and everything. So we can kind of predict a firing pattern that Josh is going to have. When we look at the spine, these and really the posterior chain that are going to function into that, we want to know what's supposed to fire first, and then know what is firing first. Then we can understand how we might need to change our movements to then have a better control for working out and doing some resistance training to keep this stable, okay? So Josh, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take, I'm gonna put a finger here in your hamstring, on your glute, and right here. So when this acts, right, so your glute contracts and your hamstrings contract, basically they're gonna move your pelvis. On the other side, your spine has to kind of resist that motion. So Josh, I just want you to pick your left leg up off the floor. Okay, down. Relax, relax, all the way relax. Good. Do it again. Okay, down, and up, and relax. Okay, so what do you think I just felt right there? Just guess the firing pattern that I felt between like hamstring firing and the glute firing and this low back firing. Anybody guess what just happened there? Just based on looking at it right here. Like based on which muscles do you see predominantly of him just laying down? You're totally judging his body. Okay. Anybody got a guess? Right? So when I asked him to pick up his leg, what happened is his hamstring got really tight, and then his lower back got really tight, and then his glute got kind of tight at the end, right? We can kind of predict that. Like I said, he's got some pretty big hamstrings, but his glutes are a little underdeveloped. The reason why we want to know this is because if these two are not firing in the right pattern, and this is firing, say, before the hamstring or the glute, we know that he's acting concentrically here. So he's not actually training this for its proper function of stabilizing the pelvis. He's trying to create movement through it. Okay, do you ever get pain in your back after pitching? Sometimes. And you generally probably get it. Is your right-handed pitcher? You get it over here? Yep. Right, so what we look at here is if we really want to create the most optimal pattern here so he trains these to function isometrically, and I bet you if let's do this, right? Lift your right leg up and go back down, up, down, right? That was predictable. So when we look at the actual firing pattern of your hip and then the spine to stabilize, what we want to see is glute, hamstring, opposite side of the lower back. Because when his pelvis moves from these two working into hip extension, which we'll go over when we go over the hip, this has to stabilize the other side of the pelvis because they're kind of wobbling back and forth. The pelvis kind of moves back and forth. So the reason why I predicted Josh having low back pain on this side is because when he pitches, this leg doesn't have as much hamstring, or we can kind of see a little bit. So he's contracting right here. He's going back, hamstring, glute. So he's going in the reverse direction, okay? So meaning you're moving concentrically here. So now what I want you to do, only think about squeezing your butt cheek and raise your left leg. Up, 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 there we go, right? So now you feel this leg almost relaxed. Good, do it again. Yep, okay, relax. Do it on the other side. Okay, see that's better, right? Do it again. And relax, okay? So, the reason why we go with that, your spine, your core, it all functions a lot of times to stabilize that pelvis. So really what we're looking at in that direct little bit, we're looking at the longissimus, right? Those spinal erectors and the QL are there to stabilize the spine and the pelvis, and then the spine and the lower part of the ribs, right? That's the QL that's right there, all right? So when we look at really doing resistance training and working your back and trying to strengthen your back, we're going to consider two things. Trying to train your erectors and that QL to function isometrically and to stabilize the pelvis. And then we're going to look at making the lats work in a way that is going to stabilize the lumbar spine, your traps to stabilize your upper spine, and then that way we're going to be able to help kind of develop one, make sure you don't get hurt doing some of the movements that we're going to do later, because when we get to deadlifts, we'll talk about being able to keep your lats tight. That's going to make your deadlift safer for your back, and when we talk about actually barbell squatting, okay? So today we're going to go over all that. So here's what I want you to do before we even get into any of those exercises. Lay down on the floor on your stomach like Josh is, and I just want you to go through that test. So I want you to try to find, just naturally, just however it happens, pick your left leg up off the floor 3 times, then your right leg up off the floor 3 times. See what's going on. Just don't think about how it is. Just think about picking the leg up, and then go through and see, like, if you're firing back first, hamstring glute, or maybe you might fire hamstring glute back. Try to find what the firing pattern is, and then see if you can change it. That way you kind of know how everything's working, and then that way we can actually help kind of move into some of these different motions a little bit better. Okay, so find some floor